Gostaria de chamar a Cassidy Sugimoto, que é presidente da Associação Internacional de Cienciometria e Informetria.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today to present on something that brings together multiple roles that I have. So as president of the International Society for Scientometrics and Informetrics, we care deeply about the open science agenda. As a program director at the National Science Foundation, I'm really interested in what funders can do to participate in this conversation, to move this conversation forward. And as a researcher, I want to look at these questions empirically. So I'm going to present some data on open access mandates that I've done together with my colleague, Vincent Larivière, who's here as well. So hopefully if we have any hard questions, he can join me in answering them. So I'd like to wish a happy birthday, happy anniversary to SciELO, and 20 years is truly a remarkable thing. As Luis has shown in this history, this is an early adopter, and in many ways SciELO, and by consequence Brazil, has paved the way for open access. And this is certainly a conversation that I don't need to tell this group, but we see this amazing movement in the early 2000s around open access. We saw by 2005 at least 3 distinct manifestos supporting open access. By 2007, a bill proposed to Parliament. By 2016, nearly ubiquitous participation in open access. And by 2018, Brazil is the highest number of open access journals, and 1/3 of Brazilians' articles are immediately available free to read. So this is an amazing success story. And the question for me is, what can we learn from Brazil? What can Brazil and SciELO tell us about moving forward in the open access agenda? And it is a metric of success. Now, for this group, it's preaching to the choir. Why is open access a metric of success? Why is that something that we want? Now, the open access ideology is something that we can talk about as advocates, about believing that science should be open. Science should be open both for the readers, but also, and I think this is something we don't talk about enough, science needs to be open for the authors as well. We need to have abilities to participate, and Eric touched on this in some with his Merton norms of universalism. Yet despite this, and we all would agree with this, everyone is not on board with this. There still remain several skeptics, particularly among the faculty, who need to be convinced of the goodness of open access. So many librarians who are often tasked with building repositories will go to their faculty with charts like this, and I took this from Ashton University Library. And they say, okay, faculty member, you can get increased visibility. More people will see your work, and not just people, but the public, the general public. Other scientists will see your work and they'll cite it more. You'll have more increased citations. They'll lead to innovation as people see this and use your work. You'll have global impact. And then they say, you'll also be able to comply with those funder mandates. Now, I'll give you a second to think about which is the most persuasive to a faculty member. Public good, public access? No, it's usually that last one, right? Complying with funder mandates. And that shows the incredible power that funders have in this system to drive open access by creating mandates and by creating incentives. Now, as Luis has already talked about, Coalition S is the latest in these sort of funder-driven initiatives around open access. And while there are pros and cons to this, I think we can acknowledge that having a funding-driven thing is moving the story, is pushing that needle further on open access. Now, I won't go over this. It's the benefit of being the last presenter is that we've gone through many of these things. But if we take a very simple binary dichotomy between our non-subscription and subscription, we know that funding happens somewhere. Either it's APCs that lead to that immediate gold, it's some sort of toll or subscription base that could lead to green OA through embargoes, through self-archiving. And we also have that hybrid model that's been discussed where we go from subscription to a subsidy to gold OA. So many different ways in which we get to those green or the gold or the rainbow of colors, as Eric and Jason talked about as well. But there's always a financial aspect, right? The cost of production is built into the system at some point. And as funders, we have to be aware of that place and understand how we need to contribute to it. Now, as we've seen the growth of OA, we've also seen the growth of companies that mine for OA, that scour the web in order to try to identify the open access statement for different articles. Now, we've heard about some of them here today. We have open access button on paywall, several other things that have tried to be able to tell us how much is open access. Now, because Jason's already presented, I can skip through this very quickly. The data that we use comes from InPaywall, and I will note that Eric's comments and the concerns about that, the reliance on DOAJ, on DOIs, it's a valid concern. This is the data set that we use. So taking metadata from Crossref, looking in DOAJ, looking at repositories such as Archive, PubMed, institutional repositories, we get about 95 million articles for which we have their OA status. It's important to note that things like ResearchGate and Sci-Hub are not included in this. Now, you've already seen this, so I'll only say a little bit about this, which is important for our analytic devices, is that when we're looking at these statements, it's really looking at recent data. And we see a rise in the amount of recent data for which we have the OA status, and as Jason talked about, a rise in certain classes of OA with sort of a stability of green and a rise in those other kinds of classes. Now, there has been a concomitant rise in mandates. We see a huge increase in people mandating open access, but those mandates are primarily coming from institutions, usually academic institutions. Now, do they have an effect? The data tells us that they do. From an article in 2012, we can see OA compliance from mandated institutions versus those that were non-mandated. So mandates work. Mandates change behaviors. But mandates are not all the same. When we have mandates in institutions, we can look at different kinds of flexibility, different current concerns around disciplines. There are different kinds of levers that we can have in assessment. Do we fund someone? Do we not fund someone? Can we withhold funding from them? Do we use embargoes? All of these are questions that we have. And so the characteristics of mandates is widely variable. Some mandates have embargoes, some don't. Some allow certain repositories, some mandate repositories. We have dark and open and different kinds of copyrights and different kinds of opt-out policies. So mandates are not monolithic. There's not one kind of OA mandates. There are as many kinds of OA mandates as there are institutions. So having all of that in mind, what we did was we took a sample of funder mandates. We looked in the US at NIH, at NSF, at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in Canada, at CIHR, at NSERC, at SSHRC, and in the UK and in Europe at the Wellcome Trust, ERC, MRC, others. And then we did something very simple, is we kind of looked at those different dates. How recent were they? And what we see is that medical research were early adopters for OA mandates. We see MRC in 2006, NIH in 2008, all which fund medical research. And it was really into later years that we start to see the natural sciences and then finally the social sciences and humanities really adopting those policies. Now, to calculate compliance, we did something fairly simple. We took Web of Science as our sampling frame, and many of the presentations across this week have noted the limitations of that approach, so I won't go into it. But we took two things: the national affiliation of the corresponding author and their funding, which is given in the acknowledgement data. And we matched that with Unpaywall to look at the compliance rates. What proportion of things that were funded by the NSF, by authors in the US, are open access? What proportion of authors from the US who've done an NIH are open access? And so the compliance rates that you see are going to be driven by those two samples. Now, we see a huge difference in size and scale here in the data that we analyzed. So in the NSF and NIH, the National Science Foundation and National Institutes for Health, we see nearly 360,000 papers that are in our sample, whereas for something like SSHRC, Social Science Humanities Research Council in Canada, we only see about 6,000 papers. So there's definitely a difference in scale and size across these funding agencies. So to get to the results. So we look at this, we can look at the United States, and we see that for the NIH, that's the Medical Research Funding Agency, we have nearly 100% compliance. 100% are open access, except in recent years. And you see that drop, that dramatic drop. Now, that doesn't suggest that we're moving in a direction against open access, but rather that reflects their embargo period. So many of the medical journals are embargoed. After a couple years, we'd see that thing jump back up to 90%. But that does show us that for recent years, we have less access. Gates is also consistently above 80%, but the NSF is much lower, down just about 50%, which is not markedly higher than the US overall, the unfunded research in the US, which is around 40%. Now, in the United Kingdom, you see a trajectory. You see a movement going up. Wellcome Trust at the top, and then we see the Medical Research Council right below it. But everything's seeing this great incline, particularly since about 2012, 2013, when the Finch report came out. Canada is a sad story. So if we look down to Canada, we do see, again, the medical council is the highest, but barely teetering above 60% for some years. And when we look at all the other councils, they are not anywhere above what we would expect just given the general population of scholarship. And EU looks very similar to the United Kingdom. Now, of course, we've talked about these differences in color, so it's important to break out these rises, not just with one number of compliance, but really looking at how they are obtaining that compliance. And what's fascinating to me is looking at the gold cream on top. So the gold are things that are only available in gold. And that light yellow filling in that cake, those are things that are green and gold. Meaning we're paying the APCs, but people are still taking the time to make them available in a green format. And what you see is there's very few cases, if you look at the NIH, in which things are just available in gold. And that tells you the power of infrastructure, that when you have an infrastructure there, green would be a sustainable solution. Green without gold could exist. And we see similar stories for the rest of the data. Now, many different people have talked this week about the effect of international partners. And I have to say that many countries, particularly the US, are guilty of a nationalistic approach to science funding. They talk about being scientifically competitive, having this competitiveness vis-a-vis other countries. But that fails to account for the global nature of science, the fact that science is increasingly collaborative and internationally collaborative. Therefore, when we're funding science, we're often funding science that's happening in many different countries. Now, if you remember the abysmal performance of Canada, you can look down to the bottom places there, and what we see is when you have an author coming from another country, those compliance rates increase dramatically. They're following the mandates of other countries, which shows us that the mandates that we make in one country are going to have a trickling effect on the availability of research produced in other countries. Now, we can look at that green versus gold in the UK and Europe, and I mentioned the Finch report, which really emphasized an increase in gold open access. And you can see it's huge. In 2012, we have the Finch report, and you see that rise in EPRSRC and ERC and MRC, but also a stability in green. And so we have to be very careful when we're making these mandates, and I think Coalition S, Plan S, is another example, whereas pushing gold OA can be very problematic for the thing, because the market responds, right? The market moved gold. It didn't move the needle on green at all, and that can be really problematic when we start to look at costs. So I'm sure many of you have seen these costs of APCs. We have Peer J around 1,000, PNAS at $1,450, PLOS at $1,595. We can keep going up till we get to communications at over $5,000 for the production of a journal article. If we average the entire portfolios for Springer and Elsevier, we get APCs that are over 2,000, and as you all might know, SciELO, we have it at 500. Why does it cost differential amounts to do the production fees of a journal article? And we need to ask ourselves as a community, what are we willing to pay? Who should pay? And who should determine those amounts? Now, the last thing I'll go to is this notion of cultures of compliance. Every time I give a talk on open access, someone will raise their hand and say, oh, that's all well and good for your discipline, but my discipline is special. My discipline can't possibly do open access for all of these reasons which you possibly couldn't understand. The historians, the chemists, they're all special. And the more conferences you do, the more you realize every discipline thinks they're special, right? But I want you to look at something. So I'll pick on chemists because I've heard them talk about this a lot. Let's look at chemistry for the National Institutes of Health in the US. 81% of articles in chemistry are open access when they're funded by NIH. Now follow that line down to the NSF. Less than a quarter are open access. These are not disciplinary differences, right? When we look at subdiscipline, when we really break down chemistry into its parts, it's not that polymer chemistry is different than another kind of chemistry and therefore it needs special considerations. These are cultures of compliance. The NIH mandates compliance and the chemists follow. The NSF is not, it is softer, it has less infrastructure, and the chemists ignore the mandates. So we see very different things happening, and we can see that this is not a disciplinary concern. These are creating cultures of compliance, it's creating infrastructures for compliance, and it's ensuring that that compliance happens. So I'll say the word which every single presenter has said here, which I think that means we must be onto something, is infrastructure. right? We have to build infrastructures, and this is what SciELO can tell us. SciELO can tell us about building these infrastructures. How do we create coalitions, communities of funders, of publishers, of authors that can come together in order to make open access happen? It can't come unilaterally. It has to come through this community and through infrastructures. We have to look at the effect of embargoes. What we've seen in the data is that when you embargo periods of deposit, compliance never happens. When we have space for people to deposit, they just don't do it. We can find ways to do embargo in ways that are sensitive to different issues without reducing compliance rates. We've talked about culture, right? We have to create cultures where open access is the norm, where open access is expected, it's incentivized, and we sometimes have to take both a carrot and a stick approach to this. And we need to look at APCs, and we can't let APCs drive the market. In moving too quickly, too enthusiastically into open access without considering the financial aspects of it can be problematic for science and problematic for all of us who are investigating the system of science. So with that, I'll close, and thank you.